Well, folks, thank you for joining me. As promised, this is another bonus video this week as part of our chronological Bible reading plan. Every week for the last 49, I've been coming to you week after week after week with a new tutorial helping you to read through the Bible in a year, but to also do it in a chronological fashion so you can see the big picture narrative story of God's people unfold, okay? We are very near the end, but we've realized that our narrative books have come to an end, okay? When we read through the Old Testament, we had narrative books interspersed with Psalms and Proverbs and prophets, okay? We did quite a lot of that. When we come to the New Testament, it's very similar. We have the Gospels for the first 30 years of the first century, and then we have the book of Acts, which covers another 30 years of history, and we've interspersed Paul's letters in there. However, the book of Acts has come to an end. We've run out of history books, but we've got all these other books of the Bible left to go. Where do they fit in? Well, we know that Paul wrote Timothy, Titus, and Hebrews once Acts 28 came to a close. And we also know that after Acts 28, Peter, Jude, and John had their books written as well. So I thought it'd be a good idea to have a look and answer the question, what happened in history, in this part of the world anyway, after Acts 28? What happened once the book of Acts came to a close? And a couple of months ago, I did a very similar video to this when we looked at the intertestamental period, all right? I looked at the 400 years of missing Bible, basically, between Malachi and Matthew. We, of course, have to look at extra biblical history to work out what happened in that gap. Well, that's what I want to do today. I want to have a look at the decade of the 60s, okay? Not the 1960s. We won't be talking about the Beatles and the moon landing, but we are going back in time. That's why we're black and white today, okay? We're going to have a look at the decade of the 60s and find out what happened in the Bible world, okay, in that part of the world in that decade. And let me just warn you, it's not pretty. It was actually a very, very difficult decade and, in fact, a very devastating decade to the people that we've come to know and love as we've read through the New Testament. So what I want to do in this video is I want to look at the three main people groups that feature in the New Testament, okay? I want to look at the Romans, have a look at what happened in Roman politics in the 60s. I want to have a look at the Christian community, what happened with them and how that's connected. And then finally have a look at the Old Covenant community or the Jewish community and see what happened to them in the 60s as well, okay? So that's what we're doing. It's a history lesson. Brace yourself and let's see how we go in 10 minutes. 10 years in 10 minutes, no problems, okay? Here we go. Let's start with Rome. Basically, as we know, Rome is both a city and an empire, okay? As a city, it's known as the city on seven hills. As an empire, it's a whole bunch of provinces led by proconsuls or kings, sometimes, like King Herod, okay? But ultimately, over all of them, we have a Caesar. We have an emperor, okay? He is the king of kings, basically. And in fact, that's one of the names that they would call the emperor there in the first century. Well, in the 60s, the main emperor who rules for most of the 60s is a guy called Nero. Now, I introduced him a couple of weeks ago. I have a little bit more to say about him. But in the big picture view of things, he is basically Rome's sixth emperor. Okay, it all began with Julius Caesar, who transitioned Rome from a republic to a Caesarship, to an empire. Okay, Julius Caesar. Augustus was after him, who was around when Jesus was born. He's in the Christmas story. Then Tiberius, when John the Baptist and Jesus were ministering, he was the guy mentioned there. Caligula didn't last very long, handed over to Uncle Claudius, and Uncle Claudius was murdered by his fourth wife, and that's why Nero came in charge. So Nero was basically ordained, or whatever, as the King of Kings in AD 54, okay, and goes all the way through to the end of the 60s when he kills himself at 30 years of age. We enter into the year of the four emperors. So in the year 68 and 69, there were four emperors in just about 15 or 16 months, all right? The first guy was around for about 2 months. He got assassinated. The second guy for 3 months. He got assassinated. The third guy was 9 months or something or whatever. And finally, the last guy, okay, Emperor number 10, was a guy called Vespasian who came in right at the end of 69, December 69, and led for the next 10 years, okay? What's the point of saying all that? Well, basically, the 60s was a heck of a time to be in Roman politics. I mean, they had more emperors than Australia has prime ministers, okay? They just went through them like flies. But the main reason for this tumultuous time was Emperor number 6. Nero. When he started, he was only 16 and he was actually doing okay. I mean, basically his mum ran the show. But after a few years, his true colours began to show, all right? He kills his mum. He kills his first wife. He kills his second wife by kicking her in the stomach, and she was pregnant at the time, apparently. His third wife he wanted to marry, but unfortunately she was already married. But good for Nero, right? Her husband kills himself. Well, that's convenient, isn't it? So now he can marry her. He also married two men in the 60s. He married someone called Pythagoras in 64, and Nero dressed up as the bride at that wedding. Here's the emperor, okay, the emperor of the known world at the time, dressing up, and he was the wife in that relationship. Not to be outdone, he marries another man. Oh no, he doesn't. He marries a teenage boy, in 64. It was someone called Sporgus. It was his male sex slave, okay? He had him castrated so that he would stay looking young. And historians tell us that Sporgus looked remarkably like wife number 2, the one that Nero kicked to death. In fact, he actually called Sporgus by his number 2 wife's name and would make Sporgus dress up like a woman, dress up like an empress when they went out in public, okay? So let me just say, Nero was a bit of a complicated character, and this caused a bit of unsettling in the Roman Empire. But it all comes to a head in the year 64. A massive fire goes through the city of Rome. It burns for 9 days. About a third of the city is destroyed. But never mind, Nero comes in as the hero, gives out free food and free clothes and shelter, all right? But also, wouldn't you know it, a week after the fire, he comes out with these elaborate plans of all these new buildings that can be built where the old ones were burnt, including a whole new palace for himself. Well, the people of Rome could see straight through this. Everyone knew that Nero was responsible for the fire, and he couldn't handle that politically, so he needed a scapegoat. So what does Nero do? He blames the Christians. So now we move from the Romans to the Christians. The Christians are a real easy scapegoat, basically, because they're not politically very powerful and the Jews don't like them very much. So it's really easy to blame them, and that's what he does. And so it's there in the middle of 64, about August 64, when what's known as the Neronic persecution began. All right? Christians, remember, have been persecuted for 30 years by the Jews. That's one of the main themes of the book of Acts, isn't it? It picks up the whole motif from Genesis about the older brother persecuting the younger brother. Do you remember that? Cain and Abel and Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and all their boys, and David and King Saul. And then Jesus tells the story about the prodigal son, the older persecuting the younger. That's a major theme in the book of Acts. The Jews were persecuting the Christians, the old covenant community persecuting the new. So the Christians were used to persecution, all right? They've had it for 30 years, but now they've got it from the Romans. They've basically got persecution from both sides, okay? They've got their suffering on steroids. And Nero is responsible for killing Christians by the thousands. In fact, there's a first century historian, a Roman historian called Tacitus, okay? And he tells us that not only did he hunt them down, arrest them, murder them, he would dress them up as animals and feed them to wild dogs for sport. He would crucify them, he would burn them at stakes, and even at night time he would burn them to provide lights in his gardens while he entertained people. All right, the Christians went through a devastating couple of years as the tribulation they were already going through for 30 years just went to a whole new level once Nero came on the scene. Because you remember in the book of Acts, the Romans didn't really care about the Christians. That's the whole point of Paul's trial, okay, isn't it? Every Roman governor Paul goes to, they're like, look, we got nothing against you, mate, but the Jews are like, no, we want you to do something. Well, now the Christians had it coming from both sides. It was a very difficult time. It's known as the Neronic persecution, started in 64. Okay, so that's what was happening in Rome. It was all just turning to poo. A lot of political turmoil there. The Christians were now coming under severe persecution. Paul, of course, we believe, and a bunch of other apostles were killed during that time. Well, what was happening to the old covenant community? What was happening to the Jews at this time? Well, with them as well, it wasn't too good, all right? Things were really heating up down there in Jerusalem and Judea, and most of it actually had to do with their own internal politics. There was a group of guys down there in Judea known as the Zealots. You might remember one of Jesus' disciples was Simon the Zealot. Well, this was a political activist group, basically, okay? And they had one thing on their mind, these Jewish zealots. All they wanted was Jewish independence. They despised Rome. They despised the fact that Rome was in charge of them, and they wanted to go back to the good old days before 63 BC, when Jews were independent. Do you remember that? The 100 years of independence they had before the Romans came in. They wanted that again. They wanted to go back to independence. Well, a whole bunch of wars and battles goes on. Thousands of Jews get killed in the year 66, but it all comes to a head in 67 when the Jews finally say, that's it, we are declaring independence. They had their own Independence Day, okay? They said, we're going to refuse to pay taxes to Rome anymore, and not only that, but we're going to refuse to pray for Caesar. Or basically, in their language, they said, we're going to refuse to offer sacrifices in the temple on behalf of Caesar. And that, which is at the end of 66, was a real turning point in the Roman and Jewish relationship. Nero could not handle that. And what he does is he gets his biggest, baddest general, a guy called Vespasian, okay, to gather a large army in the new year of 67, the winter basically of 67. And Vespasian marches towards Jerusalem and Judea to bring an end to this uprising, to bring an end to what's known as the Jewish revolt. Well, he does that with absolute severity. He makes his way towards Jerusalem. He gets as far as Galilee, where Jesus grew up, about 20 k's out of Nazareth. Comes to a town where he slaughters 40,000 Jews in a couple of weeks. Among them is the general of the Jewish army there, a guy called Josephus. Josephus is happy to see 40,000 of his own people die, but personally he waves the white flag and he comes over and he joins the Romans, and he becomes a chronicler, okay, or a historian for the Romans. He is one of the greatest Jewish historians of the first century, and much of the information about these wars we get from him, okay? Anyway, Vespasian pushes his way towards the city of Jerusalem. And as he's doing that, all the Jews from the surrounding area are coming to Jerusalem for safety. So the population of Jerusalem itself swells. Well, what happens? Can you believe it? Civil war breaks out in Jerusalem. It's Jews fighting against Jews. Why? Because some of them, like the Zealots, are like, yeah, we should fight the Romans. Others of them are more moderate, and they're like, no, let's make peace. There's no way we can defeat these guys. And so civil war breaks out right there in Jerusalem, and it is extended for a couple of years. The Zealots stop people from leaving the city. They burn grain supplies, and famine grips the city. Josephus even tells us stories about women who boiled their infants for food. Okay, there is complete anarchy. The crime rates skyrocket. Houses are pillaged and plundered. The streets are awash with blood. Over 600,000 Jewish people were dead corpses were thrown over the temple walls or thrown outside the gates to rot. Thousands of people tried to escape over the walls, but then they were captured by the Romans and they were crucified in their thousands, or they'd had their stomachs slit open as the Romans would look for stolen gold that these Jews might have stolen. Well, eventually the Romans take the city, which is now basically destroyed. Internally, it's gone through this extended civil war, and it's just an absolute hellhole. Titus, now not Vespasian, he's gone to Rome because of the whole year of the four emperors thing. He's gone over there to become the 10th emperor, okay, to be in charge, but he's left Titus, his son, in charge. And Titus marches on the city, and according to Josephus, was absolutely horrified when they walked into the city to see the carnage that had taken place within that civil war. Well, nevertheless, the armies go into the city, they plunder what they can, and they burn the temple, the entire temple complex, to the ground. They just leave a small piece of the western wall there, but otherwise, just like Jesus predicted, they take the temple down brick by brick and they destroy the city of Jerusalem. By the end of the war, there are 1.2 million Jews either dead or taken captive, and nothing left standing of the temple complex except for that small piece of the western wall. Sadly, exactly as Jesus had predicted some 40 years earlier when he said, not one stone will be left upon another. When he quoted Jeremiah, remember, and said, your house, Jerusalem, will be left to you desolate. When he said, this generation will not pass until these things happen. And that was the moment, remember, where Jesus' heart was broken, knowing that this was going to come on God's city, okay? Knowing that this day was going to come. And he wept over Jerusalem and he says, oh, I've longed to gather you to myself. So, yeah, Jesus' words were vindicated and, he was proved to be an accurate prophet. But I tell you what, this was something Jesus knew was coming and it absolutely broke his heart. Well, according to Josephus, the day that Jerusalem fell, or certainly the month that Jerusalem fell, as coincidence would have it, was exactly the same day when Jerusalem first fell to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, remember that story right back in the Old Testament? And so the Jews mourn that day today. It's called Tish B'Av. Well, what are we to make of this? Well, I'll share one more interesting thing about this. That Jesus' words should come true in this way shouldn't surprise us, really. But what is fascinating is that Josephus and some other Roman and Jewish historians, a guy called Tacitus and also Eusebius, also document a lot of supernatural phenomena that happened in Jerusalem around this time, and particularly just before the war broke out. I'll read this from Josephus. He says, a star resembling a sword stood over the city and a comet that continued there for a whole year. He says, before the Jews' rebellion, when the people were coming great crowds to the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 8th day of the month, at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar in the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, and it lasted for half an hour. This is a supernatural light shining inside the temple. He said at the same festival, a heifer, a young female calf, okay, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, gave birth to a lamb. A calf gave birth to a lamb in the midst of the temple. He says, moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass and very heavy and had with difficulty been shut by 20 men, okay, was seen to be opened of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. He says this signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming to them. That was his verdict, this incredible supernatural phenomenon, which, as I said, other historians talk about, was happening in the years 66 and 67 before this disaster took place. And why do I mention that? Well, I say that to say this. What happened to the Christian community at this time? We've talked about the Romans and what they're doing. Talked about the Old Covenant community, the Jewish people, and the tragedy that happened there. What happened to the Christians at this time? Well, Eusebius, who is one of the early Christian historians, okay, we've got guys like Papias, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Eusebius also wrote extensively. He says this. He says the people of the church in Jerusalem, the Christians of the church in Jerusalem, had been commanded by a revelation before the war to leave the city and go to a place in Perea called Pella. The Christians were not there in Jerusalem when this war took place. In fact, Josephus doesn't mention Christians at all. He mentions all different types of Jewish people who were there and involved in these wars, never ever mentions Christians. And Eusebius tells us it's because the Christians had a revelation and knew that they needed to get out of the city. Well, what revelation did they receive? Was it the book of Revelation? Did they have that before 66 AD when all these things started taking place? Was it the book of Hebrews? At the end of Hebrews it says, come out of the city, okay? And like Christ did when he was crucified, come out of the city. Were they responding to the Olivet Discourse where Jesus says, when you see armies surrounding the city, get out? Or was it one of these supernatural signs and wonders that Josephus describes? Was that a sign, a revelation that came to them that says we need to get out of here? Well, Eusebius doesn't say specifically. He simply says the people of the church in Jerusalem were commanded by a revelation to leave. Well, at the end of the day, amidst all this bloodshed and this 3.5-year war against the Jews, or what Josephus calls the Jewish War, it culminated in a 5-month siege on Jerusalem by Titus, which ended in the year 70. No Christians were killed in that massacre, as tragic as it was. So I told you the 60s were a very difficult, very devastating decade. A whole lot of stuff went down in Rome, mainly because of this whack job called Nero. Okay, the Christian church was persecuted beyond belief. They'd been facing persecution for years, but now it's coming from both sides through Nero and the politics of Rome. And thirdly, the Jewish community. The Jewish world was literally destroyed, much like it was in the book of Kings, when the northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians, when the southern kingdom was destroyed by the Babylonians. Their population, their city, their temple, their entire worship structure, the whole old covenant system, okay, was completely removed and destroyed during those wars. And if Josephus and those other historians are to be believed, this was surrounded by a whole bunch of supernatural phenomenon. What are we to make of this? Well, that's up to you. That's not the job of these videos. The job of these videos is to stand back and help you understand some history, to give you some biblical context. My hope in this video is that it fills in some of the gaps, basically, as to what happened in the years immediately preceding Acts 28, and in doing so, helps to provide some insight as we read these last post-Acts 28 books in our Bible. All right, guys, you can research all of this yourself. It's all available on Wikipedia and Google and whatever you want. I hope this gives you some idea. Oh my goodness, I've gone 20 minutes. Some idea as to what happened in the devastating decade of the 60s. Guys, we've got 2 more weeks in our chronological Bible reading plan. All the links are below. Bless you heaps. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you on the other side.